Hello everyone, Spirit of Thersites here. In 2016, after some 8 years in America's doghouse, the mainstream media began to embrace Karl Rove's Bush Legacy Project and to reconsider Bush. By virtue of not being Donald Trump, Bush was now one of the good guys. This line of thought and unwarranted revisionism has reached the point that some commentators called him an Avenger at Biden's inauguration. The original purpose of the series was and remains to refute such attempts by focusing on the substance of the Bush years to illustrate the profound damage he inflicted upon this nation on many levels. When I initially launched this series on Thersites the Historian, my goal was to go through his entire presidency chronologically, but ultimately I abandoned the project back then because I found that I had been too ambitious. Trying to catalog all of Bush's abuses chronologically would require an extraordinary amount of organization and prep work that would be damn near impossible for just one person. So in the reboot, I'm being a little bit more loose when it comes to chronology. The question you must be wondering is, why talk about Bush in 2021? The answer is that due to the failure of Obama, Trump, and Biden to displace the neoliberal paradigm, despite an immense amount of public support for doing just that, Bush's presidency remains as relevant as it was when he assumed office 20 years ago. Reagan and Clinton aligned the two major political parties behind the ideology of neoliberalism, but it was with Bush 43 where we saw someone who governed as an unadulterated and largely unchallenged practitioner of neoliberalism. There's a great deal that we can learn from studying neoliberalism in its purest form. The series will focus mostly on things that Bush did with government agencies, with various policies that he enacted, but I will also cover some of his more soft policy, if you will. I will cover some of his assaults against decency in America, since one of the talking points defending him now is that he was a thoroughly decent man who promoted civility. I will show that even that is false. These videos will mostly be 10 to 15 minute pieces talking about various abuses by Bush and his many minions. And so far, I have plans to do around 30 of these, but as I read more and more into Bush, I find more and more material, which, to circle back, is the reason why I'm not committing myself to any kind of strict chronology, because there is a hell of a lot of meat on the bone, and to commit to chronology would be to willfully ignore many of his crimes, for lack of a better term. One other thing I might do with the series is wait until there are events in the world and the news which correspond with things that happened in the Bush years, or where there is some institutional link between the two, and then cover those abuses as a way to show a link between recent political history and current events. Or I might just cover the things which interest me at that moment. We'll see. It's my channel, and like Eric Cartman, do what I want. If you were to ask most Americans right now who the most consequential recent president was, the answers you would get would most likely be Reagan, Obama, and Trump. These are the presidents who most captured the public's imagination, and especially in the case of the last two, really created a lot of divisive feeling. You had a very strong partisan reaction to both of them, where their supporters basically think that they're gods and their detractors think that they are the incarnation of evil. However, I would argue that the most consequential president from an institutional perspective, the person who affects your daily life the most at this juncture, is actually George W. Bush. Institutionally speaking, and in terms of policy, George W. Bush has very much reshaped the landscape of the 21st century. He founded many agencies during his time in office, and all of those are still with us. His foreign policy decisions continue to shape foreign policy to this day. Even his foreign policy appointees continue to be major pundits, advisors, and functionaries of the United States government. The strident partisanship that we see in today's politics was very much advanced by George W. Bush, although when we get there, we'll see that this was something he inherited and then worsened, rather than invented out of whole cloth. But whenever you hear someone say that George W. Bush was someone who was respectful and civil, you should really be distrustful of what else that person has to say, because as we'll see in the series, that was very much not the case. The current anti-establishment sentiment, I would argue, also dates back in many ways to the manifold failings of the Bush administration. Sure, there was some anti-government sentiment in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. You could blame Watergate to a certain extent for breaking people's ironclad trust in the federal government's responsibility. You could blame the rhetoric of Ronald Reagan. Certainly that was the goal, was to break people's trust in government even more. And there were some failings in the Clinton years as well. But really, I would say that the guy who did the most to undermine people's ability to trust the government and the government's competence was George W. Bush. The appointments that he made and the decisions that he made were atrocious. And it would be hard for someone who came up under Bush and did not know about earlier history to see the U.S. government as capable of competent behavior. Bush's defenders say that he kept us safe, conveniently ignoring that our intelligence community knew that the attacks were coming and gave the president plenty of warning. He would have done something about it, but he was a little too busy working on his golf game. Panicking now that he was facing a real crisis and that his presidency would be something more than massive deregulations and tax cuts, Bush overreacted and created the Department of Homeland Defense, which ended up being a massive boondoggle, which did basically nothing to enhance America's security, but did a hell of a lot to enrich defense contractors. While dealing with foreign powers and his use of the military, George W. Bush consistently made incredibly poor decisions, forever damaging America's standing in the world and creating both conflicts and tensions which continue to this day. Thanks to George W. Bush, America has had continual tension and friction with Iran. Our relationship with many other countries has been frayed as well. And of course, we had a long-term occupation of Afghanistan and Iraq. The war in Afghanistan goes on to this day, and as of this week, Joe Biden has been signaling that he intends to stay indefinitely in Afghanistan. We've even had plenty of senators who have said we should be there forever. Most of the thinking of the war hawks like Lindsey Graham. If it hadn't been for George W. Bush's decision to occupy the entire country to try to find one man, we would not be in the situation today. And had he not set up the Homeland Security Department and some of the other contracting systems that he put in place, which made corruption so much easier than ever before, then the incentive to make money off of these wars would not be nearly as strong, and the public's will might be heard. Most people are against continuing the wars in the Middle East, yet they continue. It's because a lot of people are making money, and the reason why they're making as much money as they are is the dumbass on your screen, George W. Bush. Presidents making poor decisions and appointing people who would not do a good job is a problem that has been with us for a while and which continues to be obvious. Under Obama, he appointed a lobbyist for the telecommunications companies who wanted to end net neutrality, and at the last minute, under immense public pressure, Obama had to force this lackey to do the right thing. Under Trump, he put Betsy DeVos, someone who is an adamant enemy of public education, in charge of public education. And most recently under Biden, he's trying to put Pete Buttigieg and Neera Tanden into the United States government, despite neither of them having any relevant qualification for the jobs that they're being offered. So this is something that is a problem in many administrations, but as we'll see when we look at Bush's running of the government, his literal governance, he was by far the worst and most inept. And some of this is not just because the man was a dumbass, but also because he had a distinctly anti-government philosophy in many ways. His idea was to govern in the interest of big business, and he said this explicitly. His appointees said this explicitly. They often referred to industry as their client, quote unquote, when they would speak with bureaucrats about who they were supposed to serve. And not surprisingly, given that Bush's ideology in many ways was cronyism and corruption, we had unprecedented levels of cronyism and corruption. From blowing a budget surplus on tax cuts, which failed to stimulate the economy and also failed to raise wages or anything like that. By the way, wages actually fell across the Bush years even before the collapse of the economy. From those failures to Hurricane Katrina and the response there, to failing to react in any meaningful way to the housing crisis and the bubble burst in 2008. And we've already mentioned his foreign policy. Bush bungled at literally every turn. This is a man who had no ability to comprehend the situation, and even if he had understood it, his priorities were so misaligned and so contrary to the public interest that there's no way he could have ever governed in a responsible manner. So we will go through all of the many, many misdeeds of the Bush years, and there is a whole lot to get through there, and that's probably why the series will never end. In 2016, Donald Trump declared that he would drain the swamp and rid Washington of corruption. His supporters to this day believe that he fought the good fight, even though all of the evidence points in the contrary direction. Trump was incredibly corrupt and filled Washington with his lackeys. The major difference between Bush-style cronyism and Trump-style cronyism is how systematic Bush cronyism actually was. The Bush administration was incredibly corrupt, but that was by design. Conservatives had an infrastructure built up to produce people who would be in their political class. They wanted to hijack government and use it to aid industry. This was a systematic takeover. With Trump, it was much more chaotic. He ended up putting in a lot of the same people that Bush had used or their successors, so he ultimately ended up carrying on the Bush legacy in most ways, albeit somewhat unwillingly and unwittingly. With Trump, it was very much based on personal allegiance. He was determined to find people who were loyal to him personally. With Bush, it was more about ideology. Are you as anti-government as I am? If so, you can work for me. If not, you will probably lose your job. So these are different forms of corruption in a way in terms of how they're implemented, but they are very similar in terms of their effect on the government's ability to get things done. And if anything, I think there is abundant evidence that Bush did a great deal more damage to the efficacy of the federal government than Trump did, because of how systemic he was. And with his practices of filling Washington with his lackeys and replacing dedicated civil servants, Bush was actually following the example of one Ronald Reagan. In the process of making the government suck as much as possible, he proved the line by Ronald Reagan that government is the problem. If you're running on the essential idea that government sucks and needs to be downplayed and kept out of the way, the best way to make that idea palatable and relatable is to make the government suck when you're running it. This is something that Bush understood, that Reagan understood, and to an extent that Trump understood, or at least understood in effect, because he made the government suck and therefore undermined people's ability to believe that it was able to accomplish things. And that is not at all to defend the conduct of Democrat presidents during this time, who also did some fairly crappy things. To put it simply, the Bush presidency was the perfect nexus between neoliberal economics and neoconservative foreign policy. Before Bush, there had been some pushback against certain aspects of neoliberal economics or neoconservative foreign policy. So under Reagan, who absolutely would have done what Bush did if given the opportunity, there was still a Democratic Party which was strong enough to resist some of his initiatives. He failed to cut Social Security, for instance, and instead strengthened it after getting a lot of backlash. He also failed to get America involved in the Middle East, but partly it's because he still had to worry about the Cold War. So with Reagan, there were some constraints. After Reagan came Bush Sr., who, even though he had a lot of reservations about the neoliberal project going into the 1980 cycle, by 1988, he was on board because he thought it was successful. He didn't really advance it much, but he didn't oppose it either. Then you have Bill Clinton. And Bill Clinton's goal and achievement effectively was taking over the Democratic Party and making it a fundamentally neoliberal apparatus. After this point, there is no real opposition to George W. Bush when he comes into power and decides to go all in on neoliberal economics and a neoconservative foreign policy. It's worth mentioning that there really is not anything resembling a left foreign policy apparatus. There aren't really too many think tanks or anything like that which promote an alternative to neoconservative thought. Most of the Democrats who are foreign policy experts are more or less neoconservatives, but the main difference is that they're opposed to putting boots on the ground, but they're totally cool with drone strikes and bombing campaigns. However, the Bush years are unique because it was the one time where you have both of these things in full effect with very little resistance, and where you have a president who, especially after 9/11, has a blank check to do whatever he wants. And this is what he chose to do with that opportunity. Get us involved in countless foreign wars, and also blow all of our money giving it to his corporate friends. If we really want to understand what neoliberalism really is, I think that it's important to look at it with its clothes off. To look at it without Obama's rhetoric of trying to steer the ship slowly, or Biden's rhetoric of unity, or Trump's rhetoric of I'm trying to bring your job back, even though I'm not doing anything substantive which would cause that to happen. Or Bill Clinton's I'm triangulating. No, let's look at it in its purest form, when we had heads of departments saying our client or constituent is industry. So let's look at the Bush years, and let's look at them intensely and see neoliberalism for what it really is. If we're going to conquer this thing and get past it to a better future, we need to really understand the enemy and take the problem by the horns. So I hope that you will all join me as we explore the horrors of the Bush presidency. I'm Spirit of Thersites, and I will see you around.